Okay. Thank you very much, Professor Pratt, for the interview. The first question is, how do you define penal populism and how popular is it in different countries and what lies behind it?
Well, all right. Let's take that one step at a time. And first, I think I would define penal populism by first defining what I understand populism to mean, which is to say it refers to the moods and sentiments and voices of distinct and significant sections of the public that feel that they've been ignored by governments, unlike more favored and less deserving groups, but they've been left behind or disenfranchised in some way by government policy. And these significant sections of the public thus speak out against the machinery of government, which it judges to have been complicit in conspiracies, against the worthy members of society that they see themselves as being. And if you take that on to penal populism, then that refers to the way in which criminals and prisoners are thought to have been favored at the expense of crime victims in particular, and the law-abiding public in general, and it feeds on expressions of anger, disenchantment, and disillusionment with what it sees as the insidious workings of the criminal justice establishment, that is to say, senior officials in ministries of justice and corrections departments, judges, academics, members of the police and parole boards, perhaps, who it holds responsible for a much too liberal criminal justice policy, which has put ordinary people at risk of crime.
Mm-hmm.
And so remind me again of the
and then how popular is it in different countries and what lies behind it?
Well, I think it's been particularly popular or virulent in the Anglo-American world. Not so much so in the other European countries, although they haven't been free from it. But certainly, I think it's been most strongly experienced in the Anglo-American world, and it's no coincidence that it's been in those countries that the conditions necessary for penal populism have been strongest. And its effects are being seen with the dramatic rises in imprisonment in most of the Anglo-American countries in the developed world. What lies behind it? Well, I think it emerges out of the neoliberal restructuring that began to take place in these societies during the early 1980s and onwards, and which produced significant benefits for many in terms of access to wealth and freedom to choose how they spent their money through lower taxes and so on, but which at the same time left, as I've said already, a lot of people behind. A lot of people didn't share the benefits, and they only experienced anxiety and uncertainty as the world around them seemed to be changing very rapidly due to this restructuring, and they struggled to find a legitimate place for themselves in it. How did they then turn their attention to crime and worry about crime in an era when crime itself has been rapidly declining? Well, part of that restructuring has involved deregulation of the mass media and privatization of the media. Up to the mid-1980s, in most countries, the television was terrestrial, and it consisted of just access to just a few channels. With deregulation and with technological development, it's opened up to a massive 24/7 television network. A lot of those channels are news programs competing with each other, and what's the best way to attract an audience and thereby advertising, because they don't receive funding from the state. Well, it's concentrating on crime, and it's the same to do with the way in which the newspapers have become much more tabloid entities, feeding on sensational stories, rather than the kind of authoritative statements of government policy that you used to find in the broadsheet press. Social media takes it further again, away from the control of, takes public discourse further away again from control by government, and allows all manner of opinions to be expressed, but mostly to do with crime and fear of crime. And that's a very strong theme of talkback radio, for example. So that culmination of factors swirling around together, right? That neoliberal restructuring let loose, in conjunction with growing distrust of central government and career politicians and what they could achieve, leads to this phenomenon that I've referred to as penal populism.
Right. And what gave birth to penal populism? You answer this actually? Does each populist government have penal populism?
Well, no, I don't think it does, because I think penal populism, for the most part, as I say, it's been concentrated primarily in the developed world, in the Anglo-American societies, right? But now you are getting the rise of populist politics right across Western society. That's a different phenomenon, I think, from penal populism. In some ways, it uses the same mechanisms that made penal populism more powerful, relying on common sense and anecdote, downright lies, that sort of thing. But it's not so much. If you look at the Scandinavian countries, the Nordic countries, where you find right across them now quite strong populist parties, the emphasis there is not so much on crime, it's on fear of immigrants and what they might do to those societies. And populist governments, populist parties have become very powerful in that region by wanting to keep those Nordic countries as they are, with their very strong welfare states and a strongly protective state for what they see as authentic citizens of those countries. And that doesn't include the wave of immigrants that have headed towards that region over the last 10 years or so, both legal and illegal immigrants.
After the failed coup in Turkey in 2016, Turkish president imprisoned tens of thousands of people with flimsy evidence and sacked hundreds of thousands without any meaningful objection. How long a leader can use penal populism to consolidate his power?
it's a difficult question to answer, and I wish I could give you a definitive answer to that. I think if you look outside of Turkey, then in the Western democracies, politicians who try to use populism to gain political power tend to have quite short lives, political lives, that is, because they are quickly shown up to be fraudulent and full of empty rhetoric. And one of the best examples of that is Trump in the US. And fortunately for American citizens and the rest of the world, the democratic processes were held up against all the efforts he made to undermine them. Yeah, so there you have a very strong tradition of democracy, and it takes a much more astute, more intelligent, and more clever politician than Trump to undermine that. The position in Turkey, I think, is rather different because you haven't got such a strong tradition of democracy. It's not so, your democratic institutions of government aren't so firmly embedded. And it's allowed the current president to disregard what we in the West would see as absolutely central elements of the rule of law, and to cement his own power in that way. How long he will last in power, I can't give you a prediction. But populism, I think, wherever it takes root, usually has a finite life. It may be shorter in some societies, longer than others. Okay. It does have a finite life.
Professor, why does penal populism decrease when populism increases?
Yeah, again, I'm looking primarily at the Anglo-American world here, where those countries that most strongly experience penal populism. And what I've argued in some of the work I've published is that penal populism was used by neoliberal governments to essentially maintain the status quo. Right? That is to say, the destructuring program that neoliberal governments were pursuing, despite all the inequalities and divisions that it created. By having penal populism as part of their program of government, then it performed a very useful function, because it told the general public that, look, your enemies are criminals and lawbreakers or people who are putting you at risk, and we are prepared to use really extraordinary measures, even breaking the rule of law ourselves through using retrospective legislation, things like that, to keep them in place. So look how much we're taking care of you against those who pose the greatest risk to your well-being. So it was a way of maintaining social cohesion and allowing the status quo of neoliberal governments to be pursued. Now, it differs from, or it decreases when populist politics become stronger, because there comes a point when penal populism wasn't able to fulfill that function. It wasn't able to maintain the status quo that neoliberal politicians had hoped for. And I think there were two reasons for that. The first of all was the 2008 global financial crisis, which increased social disadvantage and inequalities, and but at the same time allowed a minority to become even richer. So those inequalities became more and more glaringly obvious. And thereafter as well, it was followed by the high levels of immigration, particularly from the Middle East to the West, or from the South to the North, East to the West. And those who had already been left behind in the Anglo-American world, the world that I know best, seemed to feel threatened even more, yes, by immigration, right? Not only did it seem to be endangering their jobs or their prospects of getting a job, but it seemed to be endangering all that they seemed to have left to cling to, like national identity. Yes. As a because immigrants were bringing different traditions, different cultural values with them into these societies. So populist politics, while using and exaggerating many of the tactics associated with penal populism, was no longer interested in maintaining the status quo. Its appeal to its supporters, Trump supporters, for example, was that, you know, we're going to change things. We're going to have, if you want, a revolution. We're going to make America great again by turning the clock back to some sort of dream time of the 1950s, when America was ruled principally by white men, or with the Brexit campaign in Britain. Yeah, we want to stop all this collusion with foreign people in Europe because Britain can make it on its own. Sort of replaying themes from Second World War and the days of empire and all the rest of it. So populist politics in those societies has arisen out of the failure of penal populism, the failure of penal populism to maintain social cohesion, and which would then have allowed the neoliberal program of government to continue, right? After the 2008 crash and growth of immigration, populist politics says, no, we don't want to maintain the status quo. We want to dramatically change all that, yes. And the way to do that is to trust the kind of strongmen leaders who know best, who know better than the experts, who know better than career politicians and civil servants and bureaucrats, people like Trump and Johnson in Britain.
Professor, in your works, you have quoted Francis Fukuyama. You know his famous argument that humankind has reached at the end of history and we would witness the universalization of Western liberal democracy. What went wrong, and liberalism seems to lose ground to populism?
Well, I'm sure that Fukuyama himself would acknowledge that he was being wildly over-optimistic when making that comment. It was certainly not the end of history. It was the start of a new chapter in history, characterized not by the tradition of social democratic post-war governance, but the end of history that he was talking about with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Iron Curtain and so on, as I said, already coincided with the growth of this neoliberal program of government and the dramatic restructuring that this made, economic and social restructuring that occurred in the course of this, which meant that a lot of people became winners and enjoyed wealth that they could never previously have dreamed of, but many people got left behind, felt embittered and trapped. Trapped in what we call in New Zealand modern society's bargain basement, right? They had no way out of it. At the $2 stores. While outside the $2 stores, they could see all the winners, or in these casino economies that have been created, all the winners gliding up the escalator of success, but they were stuck in the bargain basement. And that was what went wrong with Fukuyama's prediction, right? It wasn't the end of history at all and the continuance of social democratic polity. Right? It was the beginning of neoliberal governments and the great social divisions that created, and which have come home to roost in all kinds of ways in the last few years in Western societies.
Professor, you argue that COVID-19 actually has turned into an antidote against populism.
Yes.
Can you please elaborate a bit on this?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's remarkable in some ways, given all the damage that COVID-19 has done to individuals and societies. But at the same time, I do believe it does act as an antidote to populism. And that's because all the things that have been successful against COVID-19 are at the same time anathema to populism. So what makes, what have been the most successful ways to control the virus, right? I've argued in papers that I've written, it's been the way in which science and expertise have come to the fore again and been able to convince governments that they know best. It's been strong central governments, but accountable governments who are able to tell the truth to their citizens. Whether it's bad news or good news they're conveying to them, they're not afraid of the truth. Unlike populist politicians like Trump or Johnson, who feel that they have to tell good news all the time, right? That's the only way in which they can keep the public on their side. But in New Zealand, we've had a very strong central government, which has, as far as it can do, been absolutely straight with the population the whole time. So two things there that are anathema to populism: science and expertise, right? They know more about the virus and how to cure and control it than do the strong man leaders who say that I'm a magician, right? I know best, right? No, you don't know best, right? People don't want their snake oil cures, right? They'd much rather believe in it or hear what science and expertise have to offer. And then you've got strong, democratically accountable government, right? Able to win trust from the public. At the same time, people have been very anxious to find out about the virus and what risk they are of it. Many, of course, have turned to social media and listened to all the conspiracy theories there. It's unleashed deliberately by China, or it's a plot by the Democrats to undermine Trump and so on. But most people have turned back to state broadcasting organizations, right? The BBC, for example, has been enormously popular because it tells people the truth.
Yeah.
Right? People trust it.
Right.
Trust that much more than social media. The same in New Zealand. Radio New Zealand has seen its listeners, audience increased dramatically with its news broadcasts. So people turning back to the state broadcasting, right? Because that's where the truth is. And at the same time, I think, despite all the damage that COVID-19 has done to societies, it's actually helped to develop social cohesion, at least in some societies. I know the society where I live, one of the reasons why New Zealand has been so successful is because of the very strong social cohesion that exists in this society, due to willingness to support the government in the fight to control the virus. And the government in turn refers to us as being part of the team of 5 million, right? The entire population. And so you will get in societies where there has been success against the virus, very strong compliance with things like wearing a mask, social distancing, and so on. And at the same time, this social cohesion has meant that people are not so distrustful or antagonistic towards strangers or unwanted people, the homeless, and those sorts of groups, as they used to have been, right? In many ways, the homelessness problem is being tackled by governments in many societies because they recognize that, you know, if you're going to control the virus, then it's not a question of dividing societies. You have to unite them, and all have to be helped and cured and protected from the virus. If you leave some people out, then it's likely they're going to spread the virus. And these increases in social cohesion have also led to all kinds of volunteer groups helping the poor and disadvantaged to a much greater extent than before. Now, in all those kinds of ways, the virus itself is being defeated, but at the same time, this is a different kind of politics. It's a different kind of social action than you find with populism. It's an anathema, an antidote to populism. And we've seen that most graphically illustrated in the US election with the downfall of Trump. But I can some other examples from this part of the world as well. It saw the end of New Zealand First, a party called New Zealand First, in our election last October, which was a triumph for the Labour Party and Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern because of the successful way she'd managed to control the virus and keep New Zealanders safe through these strategies that I've just told you about. Meanwhile, the right-wing populist party in this country, New Zealand First, disappeared from Parliament, right? And there have been similar types of state elections in Australia as well. Another success story against the virus, where you get the triumph of mainstream political parties, and right-wing populist parties have been largely defeated.
Right. Professor, it has been witnessed in many countries, for example, in France, that many new criminal statutes have been passed that can be traced their impact on public opinion, rather than their actual effectiveness at reducing crime. How populists instrumentalize legislation for the sake of penal populist objectives?
Well, I think when they do that, they galvanize public opinion against particular groups in society who may or may not be dangerous, usually in a not very big way. And in so doing, the strategy of penal populism is essentially to undermine human rights. And instead of protecting the rights of individuals caught up in the criminal justice process, penal populism argues that it's the rights of the public to protection that government should be taking care of, right? So they try to redefine what constitutes human rights. And there is usually as well a very large bill to pay for these kinds of policies, because they nearly always involve increases in imprisonment with very damaging economic and social effects. And by starting these campaigns off, I mean, they intensify divisions between particular sections of their society.
Mm. What kind of risks and threats emerge through the politicization of criminal justice because of populist punitive law and order tactics in an attempt to gain support from the public?
Well, I think, as I've said, the risks that emerge relate to the erosion of human rights, which had been a feature of Western society, particularly in that post-war era from 1945 through to the early 1980s, right? One of the ways in which Western societies distinguish themselves from other social formations was to say, well, look, we have the rule of law here. And if individuals get into difficulties or in trouble here, then we protect their human rights. And that is what makes us leaders in terms of the freedom we offer our citizens. Now, it strikes me that one of the dangers of penal populism is the way in which it erodes that understanding of human rights and tries to substitute a new understanding based around public protection by using measures that involve variously retrospective legislation or hybrid legislation, or changing rules of evidence to make convictions more easy. Strategies like that fundamentally undermine the rule of law and allow for initiatives that were previously thought to have no place in a democratic world. I'll give you an example. We have public protection orders in New Zealand, which mean in effect that if sex offenders coming to the end of a finite prison term are still judged to be a serious risk to the public, then the court can order that they must be detained in prison at the end of their sentence indefinitely, right? They don't call it prison, right? Because this is the West and we don't lock people up arbitrarily on the because when they haven't committed a crime. It's called civil detention, but essentially they stay in prison. Yeah,
civil detention.
Civil detention. I mean, but they're still in prison. It's not called that because in the West we don't like to think of or arbitrary imprisonment like that. But that's what can happen now with legislation that we have in New Zealand to that effect, similar in Australia, similar in the US with their sexual predator legislation.
Penal populism gives way to harsher mechanisms for social control to address the public's demand to be tough on crime. How do you assess ties between penal populism and authoritarianism?
Well, I think penal populism, it's those who are associated with it and promote its strategies usually say that we're doing this to protect democracy. Yes. We are the defenders of democracy against these criminals and lawbreakers, terrorists, and so on, who pose such a risk to us. And at the same time, they're very coy with the language they use. I've just given you the example of the way in which post-prison detention in New Zealand isn't actually called that. It's called civil detention, yeah, to give it some sort of legitimacy. Whereas authoritarianism, I mean, I would guess, just doesn't bother to pretend it's defending democracy at all. Democracy, in the eyes of authoritarian leaders, would seem to be a dangerous exercise altogether. And it's much better to have strongman leaders, yeah, like Trump, and do away with democracy altogether, because people make the wrong choices, or the wrong people vote, yeah, and then they are more likely as well to try to involve the military to prop up their rule, right? And I mean, because they've got no particular interest in pretending that they are defending democracy. So that is the distinction I would make there.
All right. Professor, last question. When one talks about penal populism, it is Duterte name that first comes to mind. However, Duterte is not the only penal populist in the world. Could you please make a short list of penal populists or law and order populists around the world?
Well, I don't know how good my geography is, and I don't have knowledge of all the world's leaders. I mean, my knowledge of the world is confined in the main to Western Europe and some of the Asian countries.
Mm-hmm.
But I would say that rather than give you a list of leaders who have relied on penal populism to maintain their power, I would give you leaders or governments or countries where you've had triumph of social democracy against populism. And we've had that in New Zealand. You've had that in a number of Western countries, like the Czech Republic, I think, Slovakia, Slovenia, where else? I think democracy has largely held firm, right? The Netherlands, for example, I think there was an election there just the other week.
Mm-hmm.
And the populists there didn't do much, right? From my understanding, right? Which isn't to say that haven't got populist leaders in doing well in other countries. You know, the picture is very fluid, obviously. But I don't think it's as gloomy a picture as some people make out. And I think social democracy, by and large, is holding up reasonably well against these thrusts from populists, often because once they do come to power, then they are shown up to be nothing more than ignorant, malevolent clowns. Trump is the best example of that, but we've had other examples, I think, in Italy, the collapse of the populist government there. I think as well in Austria, something similar happened there. So I think there should be hope around the world. And I think that COVID-19, despite everything it's done and the damage it's caused, one of its biggest casualties will prove to be populism.
All right. Professor, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. My pleasure.
We will keep in touch.
I hope so. Thank you very much.
Thank you. All the best.